Again, this is an opportunity for anyone that does want to come forward as well to speak on the program if they do so want to. Any further discussion on the motion to approve? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padrigula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Motion approved. Number 5 on our agenda is the Souris Valley Animal Shelter DoD Defense Community Infrastructure Pilot Program, GAO23. The Souris Valley Animal Shelter is a nonprofit organization that shelters animals in the northwest region of North Dakota. Over a span of 40 years, the shelter has helped approximately 100,000 animals and people through adoptions, emergency services, community programs, and county contracts. The proposed grant will allow the SVAS to create a state-of-the-art animal shelter by expanding and updating the current building to provide the highest quality of care for animals in capacity for programs for Minot and the military families that they serve. The recommendation before us is the Souris Valley Animal Shelter. The SVAS requests the approval to apply for the Office of Economic Adjustment, the OEA Department of Defense program entitled the Defense Community Infrastructure Pilot, the DCIP, utilizing the City of Minot as the pass-through entity.
Move approval. Second.
Motion by Alderman Pittner, second by Alderman Wolski. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion on the motion? If not, I would only just take the opportunity to look back 9 years as the Souris Valley Animal Shelter was operating out of the North Central NDSU Extension Center south of town for their emergency shelter during the flood. And acknowledgement of that is a couple of my pets were there as well. So, seeing no discussion, we'll call the roll.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padrigula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Motion approved. All right, that is the end of our actionable items. That takes us on to 6. Despite Mr. Straight's opposition to this, we are pressing forward here with the presentation of awards for the outgoing council members. So if you would indulge me. We can maybe turn this around. We can maybe just step to the side of it. We're okay here. So first and foremost, just for the acknowledgement here, in the name of the City of the People of Minot, Certificate of Appreciation presented to Shannon Straight, Minot City Council, service from June 28th, 2016 to June 23rd of 2020, in grateful recognition of outstanding public service faithfully rendered to the City of Minot. You can't get a better ringing than that. So through a lot of activities, of course, he's wearing a shirt that we all wore together for a change of government that took place here a number of years ago. Through the good times and the bad, the agreements and disagreements, no one can accuse you of being anything but passionate towards some of the different activities, including Friends of the Souris. So Shannon, we very much appreciate, I know the community appreciates all the hard work that has gone into service to the Minot City Council and also to improvements within our community. So,
thank you.
As with that, I left the cover on here.
Great.
But for the City of Minot,
I don't want
Mayor
that
O'Coin.
poison with COVID.
Okay, thank you. Microphone over here. Alderman Wolski. In the name of the people of the City of Minot, Certificate of Appreciation presented to Mr. Josh Wolski, City Council, service from June 27, 2017 to June 23, 2020, in grateful recognition of outstanding public service faithfully rendered to the City of Minot. Also another member of the Make Minot organization that moved forward for the reduction of the council from 14 down to 6 with a voting mayor. A lot of thought and a lot of planning went into not only that process, but every process that has moved forward through all of the different activities on City Council and also within the Friends of the Souris and other organizations. I know each one of you have sat on a number of committees and put in a substantial amount of time. And I think that that's one thing that a lot of folks out in the community don't necessarily take enough recognition of just how much time now that goes into a lot of these different committees and a lot of different activities within the community, as it should. So Alderman Walski, I very much appreciate all of your hard work, your dedication, and to all of the people that you've certainly stepped forward to help out, and as well, make sure I've got the right one here. These don't have any value, by the way, but again, appreciate all the hard work and dedication, agreements and disagreements and everything else. So thank you both for all of your service. And seeing as Alderman Patagula, you're not going anywhere, I don't have a presentation for you, but we'll catch you down the road, I promise. With that, that does bring us to the end of our activities for our scheduled agenda for this council. Number 7 on our agenda is the adjournment for the sitting council.
Move to adjourn, Mr. Mayor.
Motion by Alderman
I'll second.
Straits, second by Alderman Walski. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.
You're leaving, are you, Josh? You're not leaving, are you? I need some signatures from you.
We do have some signatures, I believe, before you guys were running out of City Hall. I think we do have some bills that we need paid. Kelly, do you want to change names?
I need Shannon's signature on that, too.
Shannon, you need to come back up here.
There's 3 of them. Did you sign all 3?
As we finish up a little bit of work on the legal side, number 8 is going to be the swearing in of our new aldermen. So give us just a moment to get a few things put together.
Thanks, guys.
I don't have that authority. No. Not a word. Chelsea? How about you? I do.
Thank you, sir.
Wear it around town.
You bet. Okay. The oath.
They can sign this here.
Okay. Does she need a copy of that to read?
She's got one.
Okay. And at this time, I would invite Devon Beckman to come up, chaplain, so that we can swear in our newly elected council members to the Minot City Council. I'll actually bring you over here to the microphone, and then bring up our newly elected.
You'd raise your right hand and repeat after me. I state your name, do solemnly swear
I, Tom Rouse, do solemnly swear
Oh, I, Carrie Evans, do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota,
and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota,
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
I will faithfully
that I will
discharge
faithfully discharge the duties
of the office of City Alderman
City Office Alderwoman
for the City of Minot, North Dakota,
for the City of Minot, North Dakota,
according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
I would welcome our newly elected to come to the dais.
used to be there, but we're socially distancing.
We do have a little bit of paperwork as well, so that you can sign on the bottom line for your oath of office as well. Let you get seated here, and then we will wait for our city clerk to get seated, and we'll take roll call. Roll call, Kelly.
Evans. Janser. Olson.
Here.
Pittner.
Here.
Padragula.
Here.
Ross. Sitma.
Here. All present and accounted for. Before we roll on to item number 10, I do have one item that I do want to, unless that there is opposition to a proclamation that I had indicated that we would consider prior to, or at the last meeting, rather. If no objections, I would then proceed, and we'll come back to number 10. Proclamation for the City of Minot proclaims June as the LGBTQ Pride Month, whereas the City of Minot recognizes the month of June 20th or June 2020 as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Pride Month throughout the City of Minot, and whereas the City of Minot will observe the Pride Month with a pride flag raised ceremony to honor the history of the LGBTQ liberation movement and to support the rights of all citizens to experience equality and freedom from discrimination. Whereas the rainbow flag is widely recognized as a symbol of pride, inclusion, and support for the social movements that advocate for the LGBTQ people in society. And whereas all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, the LGBTQ individuals have had immeasurable impacts to cultural, civic, and economic success in our country. Whereas City of Minot is committed to supporting visibly dignity and equality for the LGBTQ people in our diverse community. Whereas while the society at large increasingly supports the LGBTQ equality, it is essential to acknowledge that the need for education and awareness remains vital to end discrimination and prejudice. Whereas this nation was founded on the principle that every individual has the infinite dignity and worth, and the City of Minot calls upon the people of this municipality to embrace this principle and work to eliminate prejudice everywhere that it exists. Whereas celebrating the Pride Month influences awareness and provides support and advocacy for the Minot's LGBTQ community and is an opportunity to take action and engage in dialogue to strengthen the alliance, building an acceptance and advance the equality of rights. Now, therefore, do I, Sean Sitma, the mayor of Minot, hereby proclaim June 2020 as the LGBTQ Pride Month in support of the LGBTQ community. With that, we will move on to number 10. There is a handout as well for reference in front of all of the aldermen and alderwomen before us tonight. We do have the memorandum for the election of council president and vice president. We will start with the election for our new council president. Is there a nomination for council president?
Mr. Mayor?
Alderman Janser.
Mr. Mayor, I nominate Alderman Olson to be president.
We do have a nomination by Alderman Janser for the seat of president for Alderman Lisa Olson.
I will second the nomination.
There is a second to the nomination for Lisa Olson as the president of Minot City Council. Are there any other nominations for president? Are there any other nominations for president? Seeing none, I would look for a motion to close out nominations.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Pittner. Is there a second?
Second?
Second by Alderman Janser. Close out nominations, and for Alderman Lisa Olson for president, please call the roll.
Pittner.
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Ross.
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes.
Evans.
Yes.
Janser.
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Motion is approved. Just for the sake of acknowledgement as well, this is also representing the very first time that a woman has served as president of the Minot City Council. Congratulations, Alderman Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Moving on to number 11, this is the election of the City Council Vice President. Opening up nominations, I would look for any nominations for Vice President.
Mr. Mayor, before I make a nomination, I'd like to make a comment.
Please.
In the past few months, there's been a lot of conversation about an executive committee, which in our city bylaws, there is no executive committee. We have a mayor, we have a council president, and we have a council vice president to ensure the continuance of governance. So I certainly feel that the role of council president and council vice president fulfill that need. And I think that anyone up here could certainly fulfill that need. But there's also been kind of a growing sense of wanting some change. And we have 2 newly elected aldermen sitting at the dais. And with that, in that spirit of change, I would like to nominate Carrie Evans for council vice president.
We have a nomination for Carrie Evans, Alderwoman Evans for council vice president.
Second?
A second by Alderman Pittner. Are there any other nominations for vice president? Any other nominations for vice president? Seeing none, I would take the motion to close nominations and for a vote for Carrie Evans as the vice president of the city council.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Pittner. Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Evans.
Motion is approved. Just for the restatement here for the folks that might be watching at home, the council president, Alderman Olson, the vice president is Alderman Ms. Carrie Evans. We do have then on number 12, our appointment of the city committees. I did hand out a number of, actually 2 pages for the committee assignments. I think actually printed them out on one. For the sitting aldermen, there are a couple of committees that are not changing. However, there are some that we are going to, I think, shift some of our assets into a couple of areas that we're expecting a little bit of work. And also, as I've had discussions with some of the aldermen prior to the meeting, looking at some of these appointments as well. And I will use the county planning as my example, as that was my very first committee assignment that I spent quite a bit of time on. It was exceptionally educational for me, but also a great way to build some of those relationships within the county, as well with the All Seasons Arena Board and many others. So if there are no objections, I would look for a motion to approve the committee assignment.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Pittner. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Evans.
Motion is approved. That takes us to our final item on the agenda tonight. Certainly not going to be the shortest one. Typically in years past, for anyone who has sat or watched the council proceedings of the past, typically these were some of the shortest crossover meetings that took place. Tonight, we are changing things a little bit simply because the budget took somewhat of a change of course in early March when COVID-19 hit. The staff has spent a tremendous amount of time going in and reworking the numbers, taking into account the impact that COVID-19 has had across the state, because that is simply is going to have a significant impact on us, as well as locally within our sales tax revenues and the effects that tail down from there. So given the opportunity, rather than calling a special meeting for a budget workshop, Dave and the rest of the staff also agreed that this would be a great opportunity to open up the fire hose, so to speak, on night number 1. But for the rest of us, getting a lot of new numbers, as we have taken our 5-year budgeting forecasting model and somewhat threw it out the window. So good evening, Mr. Lakefield.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Congratulations to the new members of the council and the new leadership. I promise I'll try to keep this brief and make things rather as efficient as possible. For the new council members, don't feel overwhelmed. We have some time scheduled here in the next couple of days to visit a little bit more, and we'll go into this in some more detail. So some of this is very high level and where we're at in today's world, and just to kind of get a little bit of a glimpse of some of the challenges that we have coming up. The approach that we took with the preparation of this is we basically went back to some of the last budget workshops that we did, and in particular last year's budget workshop, where we were at and what our projections looked like at this time last year. And we're going to contrast that a little bit with how things look today. We're just going to move through here rather quickly, the introduction here, some of the key points that we're going to hit on. And of course, at the end, we'll have some open discussion and opportunity to answer some questions. The budget timeline, here we are, June 23rd already. Yesterday, we had the public meeting for the pay plan. We're in the process of meeting with the individual departments. We've already got some of them behind us early this week, and we'll hopefully finish those out in the remainder of the week. And those meetings with the department heads, myself and the comptroller sit down and meet with them and look over the budgets and look at their requests. And this is our first opportunity to kind of pare down those budget requests. And in some cases, we find things that we overlooked or that weren't included in the first round. So hopefully we narrow those budgets down a little bit, and we start our work from there. After we meet with all the department heads in July, we start to really put the meat and potatoes together here and come up with a budget that's going to hopefully get approval late in August from the City Council. We'll have that preliminary budget ready at the end of July. It gets assembled and delivered to the council for in August 3rd at the August council meeting. Then we have a Q&A session where you have the opportunity to ask questions about individual line items or how we came up with certain numbers. That will be August 17th. The president's message is due at August 26th. And then, of course, the first reading is September 7th and final budget on September 21st. In the past, we've had some special meetings to consider the budget, and this year we've tried to include those with our regularly scheduled council meetings. All right, quickly, we're going to look at some legislative impacts that happened in the last session and a couple of them that we anticipate coming up in the upcoming session. Last year was a good session for us. Hub City money, we got a change in the funding formula that made it look like we were going to get probably about $2.5 million in extra Hub City funding. The reality is today that's going to be about flat with where it was in 2019. So that projection is going to be a little more than $2 million less than we had anticipated in the 2020 budget. State Water Commission funding, we were very successful with the appropriations from the Water Commission. Getting $82.5 million for water projects in the city in this area, including the Mouse River Flood Control Project for the biennium. So that was very good news. The bad news is that is funded almost exclusively from oil tax revenues. So in the last few weeks here, the Water Commission has reached out to us and asked for ways that we could reduce our spending in those appropriations. The ask was for about 40%, and we identified some areas of the flood control that were delayed and impacted where we wouldn't have necessarily spent that funding in this session, and offered that up in anticipation that that would be funded in a future biennium. So that's about a 40% decrease, which was about $33 million that we're not expecting to see in this biennium. The revolving loan fund was some legislation that we supported in the last session, and unfortunately that was not successful in the last session. It failed in the House of Representatives at the very end of the session, and that will be a topic of discussion as we move forward in the next session. Our financial position. First of all, I thought we should step back and take a really quick look at where we came from and what got us into the position that we're in today. And Derek had put together this clip before.
Sirens are sounding right now.
Okay, you can hear them right now.
We'll just listen and take our live shot maybe from 16th from the water plant.
Late last night, city crews worked to fix some leaks in some temporary dikes that have been put up. Residents and city crews have been logging some major hours.
Oil to 147 we went.
Oil prices have finally started to catch everybody's attention.
But everything said and done, we are seeing history made right now with oil dropping down well below $43 a barrel.
State lawmakers have agreed to fund the major parts of a plan aimed at preventing disasters such as the 2011 flood.
Now, there is still work to be done from city leaders on the local share of this project.
So that slide is a little bit dramatic. I particularly like the oil to 147 we go. Who would have ever thought that now in 2020 we would have seen negative oil prices? So a dramatic turn of events there that's had a profound impact on city finances. So some of the things that have affected our city budgets in the last decade, of course, the flood and the recovery that came along with that, the oil boom, and then the kind of scaling back of the oil industry, ramping up again, and of course now we're in the trough of the cycle as well. Along with all that sudden growth came increased infrastructure, increased demands on the city, and of course we have to maintain that infrastructure and those additional services that were installed in the last decade. Financial impacts. Of course, the city has grown tremendously in the last 10 years. Additional buyouts and properties that now have to be maintained by city staff. As a result of the flood, we saw some loss in taxable assets, property tax values, the ongoing construction of flood control and NAWS, and then the ongoing operation and maintenance to maintain those structures. Again, the oil impacts, rapid growth, population influx, and then the construction to accommodate that. And we saw that in the increase in hotels and apartments, and then eventually into the single-family homes. Along with that comes additional calls for service and maintenance, and the ongoing upkeep with the additional infrastructure. Now here's the really fun part. So that was just kind of the broad overview of the last decade and some of the impacts that we've had affecting the finances of the city. So this is going to be the primer for the city government, the revenue side of things, and this is probably the most volatile side of our budget this year. So generally, we have a couple of different ways to divide this up. And governmental funds are typically the types of things that are funded by special revenues or property tax. And the other side of that is our proprietary or enterprise funds. And those are business-like functions that the city operates. So our water and sewer, those types of activities that we would charge a service for and operate like a business. So fund revenues for the governmental funds, typically property taxes, state aid distribution, which comes from the state's sales tax proceeds, sales tax that the city imposes, fines, fees, assessments, franchise taxes, licenses and permits, grants, and of course interest earnings. The uses of those funds, some of the biggest ones, public safety and general government, library, our IT, our traffic and street departments, property maintenance. We used to have recreation and auditorium. We still have the buildings, and of course city council, and then some infrastructure and capital purchases. Enterprise funds, the main sources of revenue there are the fees that we charge, or usage fees or connection fees, airport revenues that are charged to the airlines and the concessionaires to use our services or our facilities, cemetery fees, parking revenues, special assessments, and of course interest earnings. Uses there are to provide for personnel and the services that the city provides, like water, sewer, storm sewer, cemetery, parking, and then the maintenance of all of those infrastructure items as well. So enterprise fund, here are the main enterprise funds we have: the airport, the water and sewer, sanitation, which includes the landfill and the garbage collection, cemetery, and then the parking authority. Governmental fund, again, capital project fund, special revenue funds, and debt service funds. The largest of these governmental funds is the general fund. And it's called the general fund because that's where most of our activity happens. Our general government activity is included in that. So we have general government, public safety, and the street department. Are you guys gonna be ready for the quiz when we're all done here? So, all right, so the governmental fund, and these numbers are a couple of years old here, but the important part there is these numbers stay fairly consistent. In this year, it was 16% of our governmental fund was funded by property tax, and I believe our number in 2019, the most recent year that we have actuals for, was about 14%, so fairly consistent. A very small portion of the city's budget is actually funded by property taxes. In property taxes, some of the things that they fund, of course, are general government, our streets, our city shops, property maintenance, some debt service. Some of our property taxes go to help support our transit, library, airport, cemetery, things like our emergency levy that we have occasionally had to use for extraordinary snow events or COVID-19 impacts. So we have a substantial emergency levy that we can tap into if we need to have access to that cash. In 2019, the city assessed $26.6 million in property taxes and collected about $25.7 million of that. Eventually, some of those past collections will get collected. If they're not paid, the properties eventually get foreclosed on by the county and sold at a tax sale auction. All right, the portion of the property tax dollar in the city of Minot that is actually received by the city is about 36.1%. The next largest entity is the Minot Public Schools at around 33%. The remainder goes to the Park District in the county and state. So slightly more than a third of the consolidated property tax bill goes to the city of Minot, and this is from fiscal year 2019. Okay, so property taxes are a function of values and the mill rate. So if we need to raise $4 and we have a $200 value on a property, our rate has to be 2%. If we see property rates go down to $100, then our rate has to go up to 4% to raise the same $4 of property tax values. The converse is true. If the value goes up to $400, then we only have to assess a rate of 1% to raise the same $4. So not only is the amount of money we raise for property taxes a function of the mill rate, it's also a function of the property values. And that's going to be very important. For the 2021 budget, we saw a slight increase in property values of around 2%. So that helped us out a little bit because a mill was worth more dollars than, so we could keep the same rate and raise slightly more money in property tax than we did in the prior year. Looking forward to 2022, we're anticipating that property values are actually going to decline, mostly as a result of impacts to commercial properties from the COVID-19. So restaurants, bars, hotels, even maybe some apartment buildings, we anticipate seeing substantial declines in property values, and that will impact our overall value of the mill. So if we keep the value of the mill rate consistent, which is what we did in the 2020 budget, and which we're attempting to do in the 2021 budget, and if we do that again in 2022, we would actually raise less dollars in 2022 with the same rate than we would in 2021. So that's the revenue, the quick and dirty explanation of revenues. So now we'll get into the expenses. So basically the expenses that we have are our cost of doing business. So personnel, our operating costs, maintenance, capital improvements, and depreciation. What does the city do? Our business is providing services to our constituents or our customers. So we provide a number of different services. We have library services, engineering, traffic control, sanitation, of course, public safety, police and fire, maintenance of infrastructure, public information, transit, planning, all kinds of different things. This is where things are really getting interesting. We took this directly from last year's presentation for developing the 2020 model, and the inputs remain very similar to this. Our assumptions, some of that changed a little bit. So the first one is the increase in Hub City funding. We're expecting an additional $1.75 million on a conservative estimate. Our best guess is now that's going to be flat with last year. Of course, no property tax increase. We didn't get the low interest funding for flood control. The good news is the open market for bonds. A year or two ago, we were anticipating a 4.25% interest rate on 20-year bonds. A very conservative estimate now is 2.5%, and we're actually going to go to market here in August or September with some flood control bonds, and we're hopeful that we'll see a sub 2% rate on those bonds. So that's substantial when we look at our bonding capacity and the ability to pay for flood control. Growth, we looked at property valuation, anticipating 1.5% for the next 4 years in our model, or 5 years. And we saw about a 2% increase in 2021 for the budget. But like I said, we're anticipating that we'll give that up and then some in 2022. Our personnel increase was around 4% is what was assumed. We actually came in substantially less than that with our early projections. Inflation is still constant at around 2%. And sales tax, we were projecting an increase of around 2.5% at this time last year. We thought that was fairly conservative. And we've revised that, and we're saying that we think our sales tax numbers are going to be down by 25%. And we were fortunate. We've been using a very conservative estimate for sales tax collections in the last few budget cycles. We were projecting around $10 million per penny for collections. In 2019, we actually finished the year at around $11.4 million per penny. So we had a little bit of a cushion there. We had budgeted 10 in the 2020 budget. So the first million, or 1.4 million, we had the capacity to absorb just in our estimate. So the remainder of that, and we're anticipating about 8.5 million for 2021. That's where we're using in our budget projections. So that's another $3 million that we'll have to make up. All right, this is from the 2019 5-year projection model. Most of you are familiar with this. The dashed line on the bottom is our revenue. The solid line on the top was our projected expenses. And of course, we want those to be tracking very similar. So this was a bit of a problem. We had some ways that we thought we were going to fill the gap for the 2020 budget. And the ones in the center here, the Hub City Oil and Gas and the increase in sales tax, was how we were going to project filling that in. And of course, that is now off the table. So we have to back up and go to the drawing board and fill in those gaps with another mechanism. This was the projection for the 2020 budget with the 5-year model. And in the 2020 budget year, we had those numbers fairly well aligned. Now with the decrease in revenues, the only way to accommodate that is to offset expenses or find another revenue source, which is very difficult for an organization like the city to do in mid-year. So our only option is really to cut expenses to bridge that gap. And that's what was done here a few months ago when we cut two fairly substantial capital projects out of the current year's budget, that being the City Hall retaining wall and the Northwest Fire Station. So that's helping to bridge that gap for the current budget year. All right, financial drivers and challenges. These are some of the budget modifications that have been done in the last 3 years. Of course, delaying purchases, deferring maintenance, using some reserve funds, eliminating some community facilities and grants, reducing organizational donations, readjusting some sales tax allocations, eliminating FTEs, and of course, reducing operating expenses. Our 5-year capital improvement plan that we have that we're looking at in the 2021 budget is $422.83 million. And that's a lot of money when you look at a city our size. The bulk of that is comprised of the Mouse River Enhanced Flood Control Project and the NAS project. The good news is some of that money has been already put aside and held in reserve to fund those projects, in particular the NAS project. With the flood control project, we have state funding with that as well, and of course we're anticipating some debt issuance to help fund that. Okay, I don't know if the computer is going to allow me to do this, but this was the slide from last year for the funding of flood control. So I'm going to try to do something here. We'll see if it works. So we have this arrow here that points out the point where payments exceed revenues, and that's a problem. The shaded in area is our bonding capacity, and this is using the scenario of 125% coverage ratio, the 4.25% interest rate, and a 20-year bond. So in this scenario, we were looking at being out of funding sometime between 2021 and 2022. So without another funding source or something changing, we would have reached our capacity to finance flood control. So just to point out that everything is not doom and gloom, sometimes there is some good news out there. The decrease in interest rates and the delay on some of this flood control project and pushing some of that a little bit later, with the way the scenario looks today, that number is actually pushed out to between 25 and 2026. So that's how big of an impact that reduction in interest rates has on these large projects. Of course, if we were to get the low interest financing that we've asked for from the state government and will continue to ask for, if we look at a longer term low interest loan, it looks like we can fund this out well past 2030. Budget focus and directives. The marching orders were no levy rate increase, and that's what we've tried to hold to so far. A couple of things with the sales tax allocations. We've continued to hold those consistent with the last budget year. The biggest thing here that has changed in the last few years is reallocating a portion of the second penny sales tax to NAS, and then the amounts of the both pennies that get allocated to flood control. Last year we're at 68% of a penny is used to fund flood control, and we've kept that consistent this year as well. So overall, 77% of the sales tax funding goes to property tax collections, or 77% of 1 penny goes to property tax offsets. 68% of a penny goes to flood control, 40% of a penny goes to NAS, and the remainder goes to economic development. Second penny sales tax was scheduled to expire in June of 2021, and we're in the process of reinstating that or extending that. It's scheduled to come before this body on the July 6th meeting for the second reading. We're just awaiting a response back from the State Tax Commissioner's Office with the language, and there's some confusion on the dates, so we wanted to make sure we had that correct with them. This is where things get ugly. This is our graph of sales tax collections for the last 4 years and so far in 2020, and as you can see, the most recent collection that we got, and that was just, I believe on Monday that came in, it's depicted as May here, is the lowest month that we've had in 4+ years from sales tax. So one of the things why this is a very high level budget workshop here tonight is because we're waiting to see how things pan out with sales tax collections. And July, July is going to be the only additional opportunity we'll have to look at that. So we'll have to make a decision once we get those numbers in exactly where we think we're going to be at. Right now we're at $8.5 million per penny. If the next month worth of collections come in substantially lower than anticipated, we might have to revisit that. And that would mean additional modifications to the budget to make up for that lost revenue. If we do have a good month of collections, I still don't think we're prepared to do the home run jog. We're still going to be very conservative in our estimates. It'll just make us a little more comfortable with where we're at with that. Available reserves, and this is a little bit dated slide as well. The one thing I want to point out here is, we anticipated 2 years ago in using a substantial amount of reserves, and the idea was that that would be depleted. And some of these reserves are reserved, for bond covenants or operating reserves or other types of things or they're committed because of the NDR grant or those types of things. The thing I wanted to point out here is, in this slide, we're saying that we had available reserves of just under 16 million and reserves being used in future budgets of 33 million. So if you add those two together, it's right around 48 million. And if we look at the end of fiscal year 19, we have substantially more than that is not committed in the current budgets. So that's a combination of a couple of different things. First of all, we've collected some funds, primarily in sales tax, that we hadn't anticipated. So we had a little more in revenues than we thought. The second thing is we've managed our budgets. We haven't spent all of our budgeted money on the expense side. So we've been able to return some funding to the general fund balance. And we've also reduced or eliminated some capital projects in there as well. We've had some projects that we had estimates on, and the bidding opportunities have been very competitive, and we've been able to save some money. And some of these projects have been delayed or eliminated as well. So it's good news. We're well situated financially, and I just wanted to point out that we're not in dire straits by any means. This slide goes to show some of the changes in grants and donations. They've seen substantial decreases in the last few years. I can tell you right now, we've had some requests for additional funding, and primarily from organizations that have been very busy recently, and not to pick on anybody, but First District Health Unit has been extremely busy with their response to COVID-19, and they are going to be asking for additional funding, not in excess of what they were receiving prior, but getting closer to where they were prior to these reductions. So that's a kind of a common theme, that folks are asking for additional funding and making some justification there. So that'll be a difficult decision that we'll have to wade through as well. Budget principles and priorities, and this is where we're looking for a little bit of direction here tonight. This is a slide from the 2020 preliminary budget priorities, and many of the 2021 priorities are very similar, but a little bit of a different perspective now with how our projections are looking. Of course, maintaining compliance with regulatory and safety requirements is a must. We want to be responsive, transparent, and responsible. Lots of buzzwords here, but those are things that we should be doing as a government if we're operating efficiently. Investing in human capital, going through the retention, maintaining the people that we've invested in, and keeping them here is a lot cheaper for us in the long run than hiring and training new folks. Well-planned and well-maintained infrastructure. The planning is important here. We don't want to have all that infrastructure or a bridge that leads to nowhere type of thing. Prioritizing the maintenance of existing assets before investing in additional assets. And I talked earlier about this backlog in maintenance that we have, deferred maintenance in. Lance has given a presentation on asphalt conditions and those types of things, and we know that we have a backlog out there, and the more that we put that off, the larger that backlog gets, because instead of now doing a maintenance type project, we're doing a replacement type project, which is a lot more expensive. We're trying to plan these projects so if we know we have a street that's in bad shape and that street also has an old or decaying water or sewer line. We're going in there and replacing those water and sewer lines before we do the street, because we don't want to put new pavement on and then come back a few years later and have to repair that sewer or water line. So we're just trying to be as efficient as possible and stretch that money out the best that we can. Rewarding the conservation of resources and effective budget management, and this has been something that we've tried to promote. We've heard it, that's always a criticism, and I think it's in particular with the federal government, the mantra has always been, if you don't spend your budget this year, you better be careful because you're not going to get it next year. And that is not the approach that we have taken here. We try to have a realistic budget, and then we try to manage that budget. So if you don't need the money or you don't need to spend it, we're highly encouraging you not to. And that takes a lot of the pressure off, and that's been the message that we've been delivering on how we're attacking the current situation that we are in 2020. Obviously, we can't print money like the federal government does, so we have to manage our expenses, and that's been important. And the message has been that the better job that we do managing our expenses in 2020, it takes a lot of pressure off of us in 2021. If we can come in at $2 or $3 or $4 million less than our appropriations at the end of the year and make up all or most of that decrease in revenues, we don't have to dig out from under that hole, and we'll be in good shape for the next year. All right, that was quick. Hopefully I was under my hour. So I know that's a lot of information. It wasn't intended to be a college class up here tonight. We just want to throw some information out there. Obviously, we have a number of challenges that we're working through, and we're going to continue to be diligent. I think the number Sue gave me earlier today, and this changes by the minute, we have a deficit right now of around $5 million that we're trying to bridge the gap. So that's our goal. We're fairly solid with the revenue numbers that we have right now. The budget that we have that we're operating from is what we call fully loaded. It has our full CIP included in it, as well as the personnel plan that's being implemented. So now the work starts here. We look at the revenue side of things again and then manage back to that. Our objective is to not tap into reserves unless it's required, or that's kind of a last resort. We want to reserve that for a future cushion. Should our revenue estimates fall short, we'll have some other mechanism to fall back on without being in dire straits. So our anticipation is that we will look at making some difficult decisions to present a balanced budget, or as close to that as we can get, and we'll have to go from there. My guess is, or my instinct at this point is that this is probably going to fall into our capital program, is where that cut's going to come from. So just to throw that out there for you folks, that you guys get to make those decisions on what projects go forward, and we'll move forward accordingly. So,
Thank you, Mr. Lakefield. Any 30,000 elevation level questions for Finance Acting City Manager on the presentation, or any other?
I have like a 15,000.
Alderman Evans.
Sir, so Senate Bill 2275 that didn't pass last year, the loan program, the low interest loan, what difference would that make in this if we got that passed in 2021?
Mr. Mayor, Alderwoman Evans, the biggest thing is now is a couple of things. With the conventional bonding scenario, because our bonds are funded, or our debt repayment is funded by sales tax collections, they require a coverage ratio of 125%. Okay. And what that is designed for is when we see decreases in sales tax collections, that we have some cushion there so that we can still service that debt. So that, and initially when this was proposed, conventional bond market was at 4+%, and we were looking at a discounted rate through the state and the Bank of North Dakota of around 2%. So the rate was a significant savings. And probably the most impactful was the extended term. So a longer, a 30 or 40-year term as opposed to a 20-year term really stretches that out. And, there's several different schools of thought. Obviously, if you have a home mortgage, the shorter the term that you can have, the faster you can get that paid off and make headway on that, the less the interest you pay. Of course, it all comes into affordability. If you have a project of this size, we know what our end result is. Our obligation is going to be around $350 million for our city portion. So now we have to be able to finance that with our sales tax collections over that period of construction, and that term becomes very important to us because it allows us to finance a larger portion of that project.
One of the other components of that as well is that the long-term lower interest loan isn't just for a Minot issue at the state level. This is discussion that is going on for major projects from communities around North Dakota, whether it be Fargo with the Red River Flood Protection Project or Grand Forks with their wastewater protection project, or those same kind of loans for small communities around North Dakota that maybe need to replace a water tower that their affordability because of their small population isn't there. So the idea is that this isn't legislation just for Minot. It's a component that is built out of a statewide need on major projects that maybe aren't affordable out in that typical bond market for the constituency of whatever municipality that sits in. So we've had discussions with our local lawmakers on that, and we're continuing and will continue with those discussions moving into this next legislative session, and likely will look to all of you as well to help lobby that effort moving forward. But as we can all attest, COVID-19 has had significant impact on the sales tax revenues from the state of North Dakota, and as our finance director alluded to, we'll hopefully know a lot more come July, and hopefully those numbers look better moving forward. Any other questions? Alderman Patagula.
Thanks. Just a couple comments, Dave. I guess first of all, I wanted to compliment you and your staff, and probably the AV people too, on presenting a very clear and good overview. I think the average person, whether sitting here or out in the audience or in TV land, needs to have this kind of global sense of where we're at financially. So that's really important that people know, and that the information be presented clearly and actually fairly attractively. The second comment I'd have is I think the initial news you're presenting us is good. Things are not nearly as bad as I had feared. I think we're going to have to keep our fingers crossed. When the head of the Federal Reserve says it's going to take a couple years, probably minimum, for the economy to get back into swing, I think we have to pay attention to that. So I think we have to be quite conservative in our expenses and in our financial planning. And I think what I'm seeing here I'm pleased with, and I think meets that criterion. The one thing I guess I would point out is that if it hasn't already been done, or it isn't on your list of things to do, is I think we really need to look through sources of income, miscellaneous ones. It may not add up to a lot of money, but as I said at the last meeting, if we can increase our hangar rents at the airport by a few $100s a month, it's those kinds of things that make a difference, and I think take some of the pressure off, particularly the sales tax. A few months ago, we found out that one of our fees, I think for building inspections or something, hadn't been changed in 24 years or something like that. And I really think it's important that we go through with a fine-tooth comb those kinds of fees that we charge or don't charge, those kinds of costs that have increased at our end, but we haven't increased, the cost to the person who consumes those services. I think it's also important that if you use a service, you pay for it as much as you can. And I think there's been a history of, not wanting to rock the boat, not wanting to increase things because there's some momentary pain. But I think if we do that, if we keep pace with the increased cost of rendering those services, then we don't have that sticker shock, and then we don't have, hopefully, quite as many complaints from people who are on fixed budgets and really have limited capacity to pay increased property taxes. So I think looking at revenue enhancement, maybe not in a major fashion, is something we need to keep doing. And I think it's also the principle of the thing. I'm not sure how many businesses would keep some of their costs the same for 25 years. So I think that's one area in which I think we can be much more businesslike and should be more businesslike. So overall, I'm pleased with what I'm hearing, and both the content of it and the manner in which it's being presented. So my hat off to you.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Patagula, I would like to point out a couple other things too. And we're looking at everything here, and we were on track to substantially increase our rate of return, our interest revenue from our investments, and of course, the market went south. And we were successful locking some of that in prior to the change in the market, and we're hoping that we're going to continue that trend and come up with some additional revenue through that source. Unfortunately, that market's kind of gone south on us, but again, the golden lining to the cloud there is that we've come up with some opportunities to refinance some debt that we have that has substantial savings for us as well. So we're looking into that. If we can't raise the revenue, we're trying to be as efficient as possible on the expense side to offset some of that. So we're looking at all different types of things. The last couple of years, we've strived to have a lean budget. Our preliminary expectations for the general fund is we're looking at a decrease of over $4.5 million to the general fund. Some of that is the luck of the draw. We've had some retirements or personnel changes, and we've had some savings. We're not anticipating an increase in our health insurance costs this year, and there are some things that worked in our favor to help us out with that as well, but we're trying to be aggressive to manage those expenses as well. And one of the things that we've heard in the last couple of years, that we've had the largest budget in city history, I think, last year. And some of that was from a change in how we presented the budget. And the motive or the motto that we have this year is this is the largest budget decrease in city history. And right now we're at about $123 million. And again, some of that is accounting technicalities, but that's kind of the way we're approaching this. We're trying to be as lean and efficient as possible. We oftentimes can't control our revenue side of things unless we increase rates, which we don't want to do. So we have to be efficient on the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Lakefield. And I would continue to encourage you and other staff as well, to the point of the largest ever budget, that the graph that shows just how much is coming in through grants, the NDR, the state funding for our major projects, absolutely were the substantial components of that. So I think it's really important to show just where that general fund comes from property tax to what that fits in our budget. And I think that that's a big understanding for people that may not be able to break down all the numbers, but that graph showing here's what we get for property taxes and here's what our budget is. Well, the rest of it obviously is coming from somewhere, and it's going into a lot of these big projects. So I would encourage you to keep with, I think, that easy breakdown for folks. So I greatly appreciate that. Any other questions for Mr. Lakefield before we continue?
I have an orthodox request.
Please.
With so many members of the public here, I'm wondering if, with Mr. Lakefield and his expertise being here, if any of them may have any questions. I know it's not normal, but, we have quite a turnout considering, and, I think it's a good opportunity. If they have any questions, broad questions or, concerns.
We certainly can open that up, and if, Mr. Lakefield, if there are any, you can certainly come back to your seat here, as I'm still trying to encourage as much social distancing as we can.
Maybe not, but I just, with this many people, I just wanted to make sure.
And certainly we would open those up to any of the questions, and I think a lot of this is also going to come on the first reading when we get a lot of the in-depth numbers and people can really kind of refine those questions. So if there is anybody in attendance that does want to ask a question, we'd certainly entertain that. Okay, absolutely. Before we go, I have to fix one major gaffe on my part. Alderman Patagula, you were re-elected, and I had the newly elected that came down for swearing of your oath. I can't let this meeting go without re-swearing you in for your position.
I was wondering about that.
So if you would, join me at the front.
And while you're doing that, I just want to point out, Tom, that we, for the first time in the history of Minot City Council, have more Ryan alumni on the City Council than Minot High. That's a big deal.
I'm sorry, Alderman Patagula, though, you're stuck with me for the swearing in. So if you would, if you would raise your right hand. I state your name.
I, Stephen Patagula,
Do solemnly swear that I will support
do
do solemnly swear that I will support
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States of America
and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota,
and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota,
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
of the office of City Alderman
of the office of City Alderman
for the City of Minot,
for the City of Minot,
North Dakota, according to the best of my ability.
City of Minot, North Dakota, to the best of my ability.
So help me God.
Help me God.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that has taken us to the end of our agenda for this evening. Before we go, though, I do want to take one moment to make one acknowledgement. It is June 23rd, and it has been 9 years since a different council and a different time sat here for many press conferences and watched the water fill in right out the door and underneath the 6th Street underpass and flood a great many homes and do a tremendous amount of devastation to our community. Of course, as our finance director, acting city manager, Mr. Lakefield pointed out, that our budget is impacted this year and will be impacted for decades due to that. But I don't want to ever miss a moment to say thank you to all of the people that helped out so much during the evacuation, during the time, the lengthy period of time where so many were displaced, and also for all of the people that helped both in Minot and outside of Minot, the great folks at Minot Air Force Base on the demolition and reconstruction of so many homes in Minot. It was a time for many that still is almost foggy, but looking back as one of the many, I can't express my gratitude enough for all of the sacrifice that took place by so many people that weren't necessarily directly affected, but took so much to heart, community, and mind. And we took a city that was divided by a river and brought it back together as one. And just driving through the valley today as I was doing an interview for a story, it's difficult at times to find the scars within the landscape. You really have to know what you're looking for. If you live here, you see them, but for folks, they may just see an empty lot or a house that may need an extra coat of paint like mine right now. But the community has done a tremendous amount of work in 9 years. And I know the city of Minot, in the face of turmoil and adversity, has come together in the past many times over. But I absolutely want to take the opportunity to say thank you to everyone who played a part in that 9 years ago. So, thank you. We're looking for adjournment.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Pittner. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign.